In 1956, a scientist opened a beehive in the Brazilian jungle and accidentally unleashed one of the most aggressive biological forces the modern world has ever encountered. What followed would spread across 2 continents, kill thousands of people and animals, and fundamentally change how scientists think about the consequences of human interference in nature. This is the story of the Africanized honeybee, and how a single miscalculation transformed a controlled laboratory experiment into a continent-wide ecological catastrophe. To understand what went wrong, we first have to understand why someone was experimenting with bees in the Brazilian rainforest in the first place. By the mid-20th century, Brazil had a problem. The European honeybees that had been imported to South America centuries earlier were productive, docile, and relatively easy to manage, but they were also poorly suited to the intense heat and humidity of tropical climates. Brazilian beekeepers watched their colonies struggle through the wet seasons, their honey yields declining, their hives growing weak and vulnerable to disease. The agricultural economy, which depended heavily on pollination and honey production, was suffering. Brazilian officials believed the solution was science. Enter Warwick Estevam Kerr. A geneticist trained in both Brazil and the United States, Kerr was among the most brilliant and ambitious agricultural researchers of his generation. The Brazilian government commissioned him to travel to Africa and find a strain of honeybee better adapted to tropical conditions. What he found in the highlands of Tanzania and South Africa was remarkable. The African honeybee, Apis mellifera scutellata, was everything the European bee was not. It thrived in heat. It reproduced rapidly. It was extraordinarily efficient at foraging and producing honey in warm, resource-scarce environments. It was, by virtually every agricultural metric, the perfect bee for Brazil. There was, however, one significant drawback, a drawback that Kerr was fully aware of and believed he could manage. The African bee was also ferociously defensive. Unlike its European counterpart, which might send a few dozen guard bees to investigate a disturbance, the African bee would mobilize hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individuals in response to a perceived threat. It would pursue an intruder for distances of up to a quarter mile. Its venom was no more toxic than a European bee's, but the sheer volume of stings it could deliver transformed an ordinary encounter into a potentially lethal one. Kerr understood this. His plan was to breed the African bee selectively with European strains, gradually introducing the tropical hardiness while diluting the aggression through controlled hybridization. On paper, it was elegant science. He brought 26 African queen bees back to Brazil in 1956, establishing a research apiary outside the city of Rio Claro in the state of São Paulo. The queens were housed in special hives fitted with queen excluders, screens with openings precisely sized to allow worker bees to pass through while preventing the larger queens from leaving. The experiment was proceeding according to plan. The hybrid colonies were forming. The research was progressing. And then, in October of 1957, a local beekeeper visiting the apiary made a decision that would reverberate for decades. The beekeeper, apparently believing the excluder screens were obstructing normal hive ventilation, removed them. 26 African queen swarms, genetically intact, reproductively vigorous, and carrying every ounce of their ancestral aggression, flew out of the hives and into the Brazilian wilderness. Kerr would later describe the moment as the worst day of his professional life. The queens were gone, and with them, any hope of containing what was about to happen. What scientists did not fully anticipate was the extraordinary reproductive and competitive advantage the African bee possessed in tropical conditions. A single swarm can establish a new colony in a matter of days. African queens can lay up to 2,000 eggs per day. Their colonies grow faster, swarm more frequently, and are far more willing to usurp existing European hives by invading them and replacing their queens. Within just a few years of the escape, the Africanized hybrid, which rapidly outcompeted pure European strains throughout the region, had begun its relentless expansion northward. By the 1970s, it had reached Venezuela. By the 1980s, it was pressing against the southern border of the United States. By 1990, it had crossed into Texas. The bee that was never supposed to leave a research apiary in São Paulo had become a permanent biological resident of 2 continents. The death toll was not theoretical. In Brazil alone during the early decades of the spread, hundreds of people died from mass stinging attacks. Livestock were killed. Farmers were driven from their fields. In rural communities across South America, the Africanized bee became not just an agricultural nuisance but a genuine public safety emergency. Firefighters and emergency responders who had never been trained to handle bees suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a crisis that traditional medicine and pest control were wholly unprepared for. And yet, buried beneath the fear and the tragedy, there is a deeply complicated scientific story, one that challenges simple narratives of blame and accident. Because Warwick Kerr did not fail as a scientist. His experiment, in purely genetic terms, worked exactly as designed. The African bee was indeed better suited to tropical environments. The hybridization did occur. The problem was not the science. The problem was what the science could not predict: the speed, the scale, and the sheer biological willpower of a creature that had spent millions of years perfecting its survival. To understand that, we have to go back much further than 1956. We have to go back to the continent where this bee was born. By the late 1970s, the African honeybee hybridization had become something far beyond a cautionary tale. It had become a living, breathing demonstration of how quickly nature can reassert its own agenda when human ambition pushes against evolutionary boundaries. The Africanized honeybee, now spreading at a rate of up to 300 miles per year, was not simply moving across a map. It was rewriting the ecological contract of an entire hemisphere. What made tracking this spread so difficult was the bee's remarkable adaptability. Unlike the European honeybee, which had been selectively bred over centuries to thrive in temperate climates with predictable seasons, the Africanized hybrid carried within its genetics a deep tolerance for environmental uncertainty. It could survive in tropical heat, in arid scrubland, in the dense humidity of coastal lowlands. Wherever it arrived, it did not merely survive. It dominated. Researchers studying the northward migration noted something particularly striking about colony behavior. Africanized swarms would scout new territories aggressively, occupying nesting sites before European colonies could establish themselves. They nested in smaller cavities, required less preparation time before a swarm became functional, and reproduced at significantly higher rates. The European honeybee, shaped by centuries of human domestication, had in some ways been softened. The Africanized hybrid had not. By the time the bee crossed into Central America in the early 1980s, public concern had reached a kind of fever pitch that science struggled to temper with nuance. Newspapers printed stories of mass attacks. The term killer bee lodged itself into popular culture with a grip that no amount of scientific clarification could loosen. And while researchers were careful to point out that individual Africanized bee venom is no more potent than that of European bees, the distinction felt academic against the reality of a bee that would pursue a perceived threat for a quarter of a mile and mobilize 10 times the number of defenders that a European colony would. The human toll was real. In Brazil alone, thousands of people were stung severely enough to require medical attention in the years following the escape. Livestock were killed. Agricultural workers in remote areas faced genuine danger. And yet the story was not entirely one of catastrophe. Honey production in Brazil, after an initial period of disruption, actually recovered. Some Brazilian beekeepers learned to manage Africanized colonies with modified techniques, accepting greater risk in exchange for bees that were hardier, more disease-resistant, and often more productive in tropical conditions. This tension between harm and benefit has defined the legacy of the 1956 incident ever since. Scientists point to the Africanized bee as one of the most significant unintended biological introductions in recorded history. And yet the bee itself, if we can momentarily set aside its relationship with humans, is an extraordinary evolutionary success. It has colonized South America, Central America, and significant portions of the southern United States. It has survived where introduced European bees struggled. It has, in the most fundamental biological sense, won. Warren Kerr spent decades living with the weight of what happened in his laboratory. He never fully retreated from his work. He continued contributing to entomological science and consistently argued that the escape was a tragedy of circumstance rather than negligence, a view supported by many of his colleagues but contested by others who believed the risks were foreseeable. The question of responsibility in science, of where duty of care ends and the unpredictability of nature begins, found no clean resolution in his case. It rarely does. What the 1956 Brazilian incident ultimately gave the world was not just a hybrid bee. It gave the scientific community a template for thinking about unintended consequences in biological research. It accelerated the development of biosafety protocols. It informed international frameworks for the handling of potentially invasive species. Every laboratory working with genetics today operates within a culture of containment and caution that owes something, however indirectly, to what happened when a screen was removed from a hive in Sao Paulo. There is a strange kind of humility embedded in this story. Humanity, armed with intention and intelligence, attempted to improve upon a system that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. The bees did not cooperate with the plan. They followed their own imperatives, their own ancient logic of survival and expansion. In doing so, they reminded us that biological systems operate on a scale of complexity that exceeds our models and outlasts our experiments. Today, Africanized honeybees inhabit millions of square miles of the Americas. They are here permanently. There is no reversal, no recall, no undoing of what was set in motion by a single scientific decision in 1956. Future generations will manage what this generation inherited. That is now simply the world as it exists. The African honeybee brought to Brazil by Warwick Kerr was never malevolent. It was never a monster. It was a creature doing precisely what its biology had equipped it to do, and doing it with a ferocity that should have commanded more respect before it was ever placed on a plane. The lesson it carries across decades is not one of fear, but of proportion. Of recognizing that the natural world does not grant us the authority we sometimes assume. It only grants us the consequences of our assumptions. Join us soon for another documentary.